Hello, everybody. This is Adam Serwer, and you're watching Adamize. I'm here with John Tabin of the American Spectator. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing well, Adam. How are you?
I'm great. So so the first thing we're discussing today is Mother Jones, a story that we broke this week about Mitt Romney at a private fundraiser saying that 47% of Americans don't pay income taxes and will vote for Obama no matter what because they don't want to take responsibility for their lives. And so, John, as a conservative, I'm interested to hear what you think about this. I think there's been sort of a divide between the base and the and the conservative sort of intelligentsia on this, in the sense that a lot of conservative wonks have sort of said, well, Romney's numbers are wrong, whereas the conservative base has said, well, yeah, but his larger critique about the expansion of government is right, and so he should really be making his pitch on the trail, and he has nothing to be ashamed of.
Well, as the corrupt Beltway rhino that I am, of course, I sort of agree with the more wonkish critique, but I think, I think even beyond that, I think it's indicative of the fact that when Romney tries to talk like someone who's very conservative, he speaks conservatism as a second language, and it's the kind of thing you say if you've listened to talk radio and said, okay, this is what they're saying. But I mean, there have been remarks he said on the record too that are sort of in the same category. John McCormick had a thing at Weekly Standard just cataloging them, but the one that immediately popped into my mind when the story came up was what he said the day after winning the Florida primary. He said, I'm not concerned about the very poor. We have a safety net there. And that's, the conservative view on the safety net is not we need a safety net and that's the end of the story. The critique is that you don't want to, the welfare state creates dependence and needs to be reformed to give people opportunities so that the very poor can get not as very poor, and
right, and that's something that's really interesting about this, right? Because the 47% statistic is actually the result of Democrats sort of ceding that argument, I think, in a way, and saying, okay, you're right, we need to structure our tax system to incentivize people who are low income to work harder or work more, and so we have these things like the earned income tax credit and stuff like that. And so the result is that a lot of working class people don't get tax credits for working more, and the result is ideally the purpose is to say this means that these people will work their way out of poverty, or they'll be able to make more money. But the point, that's part of the reason why so few people pay income taxes. Like that used to be, sort of the goal.
well,
It's not something that sort of happened because of the expansion of people who are just being lazy and don't want to work hard.
yeah, and there's also the conservative social policy just encouraging. One of the ways you can eliminate your tax liability is by having a lower middle class income and a bunch of children, and because of their child tax credit.
Yes.
So
child tax credit.
Yeah, Jim Antle had a great column of the Daily Caller. It was like this is just rejecting 30 years of Republican tax policy, and a lot of people on Twitter read great significance in the fact that Ryan Ellis, who's this wonk at Americans for Tax Reform, which is Grover Norquist's outfit that famously gets politicians to pledge they won't raise taxes, linked approvingly to this. Like, sort of the implication being people don't pay tax. Like, a lot of people don't pay taxes because of all of our hard work.
Right.
And the other thing about it is it's just, yes, there are 47% of people who are probably going to vote for Obama no matter what. They're not the same 47% of people who don't have a tax liability. And Some of them, there are some very poor people who are part of Obama's base. Obama also won in 2008. He won people in the highest tax bracket. It's not as if rich people are an overwhelmingly Republican, solidly Republican constituency, which is, by the way, Romney conceding it's a conceit that you often see in liberal discourse that Republicans are the party of the rich, and that's just it's just sort of conceding a whole argument that
right.
And
well, I think I've read in a couple of conservative and libertarian pundits have written things like this is like a very crudely Marxist analysis, which I think is a very funny way to look at it. But it's simply, obviously, like a big portion of the people who don't pay income taxes are elderly people who have paid taxes all their lives because they've been working, or there are people who are paying payroll taxes, and of course everybody pays state taxes. But it's just, the fact that a big chunk of these people, of the 47% are the elderly, it really suggests that, a lot of them are going to be voting for Mitt Romney because, of course, people over the age of 65 tend to skew Republican. So it's a weird argument because, on the one hand, if you just separate out, if Romney was just talking about politics and he said, as far as the math is concerned, there are 47% of people who will not vote for me no matter what, well, that might be accurate. But it was his characterization of these people as people who are just sort of, don't want to take responsibility for their lives, and that's why they're going to vote for Obama. I mean, like, a lot of these people are Republican, and they're going to vote for Romney, and it's just, I think Romney's lucky in this sense, which is that I think there is a tendency in America for people, partially because we have this culture of hard work, where people tend to discount the assistance they get from government. So I think very few people who might technically be in the 47%, which of course includes some very rich people who are able to avoid tax liability as well. But some of these people who are in the 47% certainly don't think of themselves that way and assume Mitt Romney is probably talking about somebody else.
Yeah, and the reason this 47% meme has been going around is partially there was this I am the 53% website that Eric Erickson was pushing. And it's sort of it's an old, it's actually a very old argument that, a democracy fails when a certain percentage of people can just vote for a minority to fund everything. But I think Ramesh Ponnuru had an article arguing it sort of has a logical appeal, but in America today, it's just empirically wrong that we're at that point. And he sort of addresses some conservative writings that are like, well, why is Romney losing? It must be that everyone loves government assistance, and it's really not the whole story, and we're not quite as doomed as that interpretation of events.
Right, and it's also that it's also, I think, that there is sorry, I totally brain farted there. Sorry, go ahead.
I was done, but
oh well, I was gonna say what I was gonna say before I had a total brain fart was that I think I'm not sure how politically how much this will damage Romney. I think there were a lot of columns, sort of saying, this means Romney's over because he's trashed half the country. And I just think that, there's a tendency, obviously we're very excited to have broken the story, but I think there's a tendency to maybe inflate the importance of gaffes because they make for good stories, and journalists, of course, love to tell good stories, and it's very sort of hard to understand what matters and what doesn't in a campaign, especially one as close as this one.
Yeah.
If you look at the political science, the gaffes that Romney and Obama have seized on from each other haven't really moved the polls very much.
Well, I mean, one thing that Romney says in the course of his, talking politics with high dollar donors, litany is that he mentions ads as something that are going to move the polls, and what happens with gaffes like this, if you can cut a very effective ad from them, like I think of John Kerry's, I voted against it before I voted for it. Soundbite was very, very contained, easy to quote, easy to understand, easy to frame.
Right.
And if you look at this Romney tape, there's really no soundbite that's quite that straightforward. You can cut an ad from it, like you have the narrator characterizing it, but there's no killer moment where it's like, oh my God, he said that. That's devastating. And I feel like a whole lot of commentators just read it as if there was, like, as if this sort of paragraph long statement, which does not come off very well, is going to be something that everyone knows about. And I just don't see it having that effect. And it was a great scoop, and people are interested in reading it for obvious reasons, and you guys should be proud of it. But I don't think it's going to swing the election.
I also think it's interesting. So what you were saying earlier about Romney, like, for a lot of people, the secret video means this person is saying what they really think. And I think there's some, and I think there's a big temptation to say, oh, this really is what Romney thinks, particularly among liberals. But, on the one hand, he's speaking to donors, so he's speaking to an audience. He may not be speaking to the country, but he's definitely speaking to an audience, and so that it's not clear that he's not tailoring his message to that audience. And he's also the guy who brought universal health care to Massachusetts. So it's like, if you're really the kind of guy who thinks, people are getting too much out of government and that needs to stop, then it would seem to be weird to have the record that Mitt Romney has. And so I do think it's interesting that, as you point out, there are some people on the right who actually aren't seeing this as indicative of the quote-unquote real Romney.
Yeah.
But actually, so Romney continuing to sort of put on a mask of being more conservative than he actually is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Romney is a salesman and has a long history of, he's talking to an audience and trying to sell to an audience. And I think Phil Klein wrote a whole ebook about, like, how Romney's mind works and how conservatives should deal with it. And, like, one of the points he seizes on is something you get from, like, the Romney biographies is that, he's a businessman, and he never, it never really occurred to him in the 2008 cycle that people were going to say what you said the opposite 4 years ago. Like, in his head, that's like saying to, like, McDonald's, well, you used to say the Arch Deluxe was good, and now you're not even selling it.
What happened to the Arch Deluxe, you hypocrites?
Yeah, exactly. The idea is foreign to him, and he's the kind of guy who'll go into a meeting with the log cabin Republicans in Massachusetts and say, what do I need to do to get your vote? And when he's on the national stage, he'll say exactly the same thing to the National Organization for Marriage.
Right. I mean, there's Peter Suderman, who's a writer for Reason, I think, had another good take. And generally, I sort of, like, theories of politicians I'm not huge fans of, but I actually think the sort of businessman, business consultant thing for Romney does explain his sort of ideological, I'm trying to think of the right word, his sort of, his ideological shifts and changes. What Peter said in his article was that, Romney always tailors his views to the client like a consultant. So, when the client was liberal Massachusetts, he brought them a conservative-ish healthcare plan. And when his client is the, Republican Party, in 2012, very influenced by the Tea Party and very angry with the president, he's tailored himself to that audience, that client as well.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I am a big fan of Peter's often totally acerbic writings about Romney, because Peter is a healthcare wonk, so he cares a whole lot about it. So he'll and because he's a explicitly libertarian, he doesn't have the partisan allegiance. So his acerbic attacks on Romney are often very funny.
Right.
At one time he said, "Mitt Romney has no inner life. Prove me wrong."
Well, he's very good at trashing both of them. I think in part because when you're a libertarian, I think sometimes you don't ever feel like you're playing for one of the two big teams. Sometimes, so it's a little easier to be appropriately cynical.
Yeah, I mean, I have strong libertarian sympathies, but I also have certain views that make me have partisan instincts in a way and there are things that Peter disagrees with me on a little bit. And Peter did work for National Review for a while, said to me like he just isn't a conservative, could never be, and I just feel differently, but we have some things we disagree on. So.
Well, so speaking of appropriate cynicism, so part of the story that Mother Jones broke was that Mitt Romney spent a long time on tape sort of suggesting that the two-state solution was unrealistic, an unrealistic resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I believe the Romney campaign took issue with our piece on that, and I believe you wanted to take issue with it as well.
Yeah, I thought the way that was presented was a little bit unfair because if you look at the tape and the block quote in the piece, the way David Corn writes it up, he says, Romney starts by saying he has two views, but that turns out to not really be true. And then he gives all these litany of reasons why a two-state solution seems far off, all these barriers, and then he says, on the other hand, this Secretary of State was telling me he thought that there could be a peace deal in the near future, and I didn't delve into it. And the video cuts off, and I didn't delve into it. The next line he says is, what he actually says, I didn't delve into it, but I always keep open. And he sort of trails off and moves back and moves into the standard critique of Obama for being too tough on Israel. And the way it's written on your site, it just like skips the I keep open part and goes straight to the next part. And I thought that was a little unfair. I mean, it's true that he's emphasizing he's pessimistic on the one hand, but there is on the other hand, you guys played down a little unfairly.
Well, if I could defend my boss for a second, I think that article was focused on the two-state solution, right? And I think I think Mitt Romney, when he goes on, he says that peace might be possible if there's American resolve. He doesn't really. He doesn't really say what peace is, right? So he gives a long list of reasons why the two-state solution is unfeasible. And the interesting thing is that you sort of see, one-staters both on the pro-Palestinian left and the Israeli right sort of saying, oh, no, Mitt Romney's totally right about this. The two-state solution is logistically unworkable and we should give up on it, despite whatever he might have said that we don't agree with. And so when Romney doesn't really ever say, when he says peace, he doesn't ever say, he doesn't specify that he thinks the two-state solution is possible. And I think there's a way in which the United States, because the two-state solution is really, overwhelmingly the sort of the thing that people think of when they think of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I think the actual opinions of people are different. I think a lot of people who say that for two states aren't necessarily. But do so because politically that's the most mainstream view. But he doesn't say, the two-state solution is possible. He says peace is possible. And I think that's because he spent so much time saying the two-state solution was unfeasible. I don't think it's unfair to wonder whether when Romney said peace, he's referring to, any number of proposals from the Israeli right that would result in a quote-unquote end to the conflict, but would not leave the Palestinians with anything resembling an actual state. It would there's this so-called three-state solution where Gaza is taken back by Egypt and the West Bank is taken back by Jordan, and there's just sort of the status quo, where there's nothing is changing and the West Bank remains under occupation. And in any case, it seems to me that it's not unfair to interpret Romney's remarks as implying a quote-unquote resolution of the conflict that involves something less than Palestinian independence and autonomy.
Well,
but I see what you're saying.
well, I mean, I guess there's some truth to that, except I think you're kind of giving Romney a little too much credit, actually, because he sort of concedes during his statement that he's not totally fluent in this topic when he says, I don't have a map in front of me, and
right.
And then he says, he implies that a Palestinian state might border Syria, which confirms that he doesn't have
definitely doesn't have a map.
He doesn't have a map in his head either, or he's confused, or he's confusing Golan in the last fact. But in any case, to think that he's thinking of a binational state, or the far right demographic critiques that the Arabs can be absorbed without jeopardizing a Jewish majority, or the three-state solution. I very much doubt that he's that deep into the weeds on that issue to not be talking about a two-state solution.
Well, so here's the thing that actually really bothered me about the tape was that I felt like when he was just saying, peace is impossible, this is too difficult, I felt like that is almost like a pre-abdication of leadership on the part of the United States that I found disturbing, because I think that, that sort of sends, it's hard enough to get, the parties to the table to start agreeing on stuff. But when you but Romney's remarks sort of suggested that he wouldn't really try, and he'd just sort of, leave it up to the Israelis to, get around to it. He says, we just kick the ball down the field and hope it gets resolved somehow. I think that just sort of sends the message to both sides that, nothing's going to happen. And I think that actually sort of empowers, sort of the liberal forces on both sides of the equation to think that, to think that they can, stall this or prevent any kind of peace process that recognizes both sides' right to self-determination in any feasible way. Well, yeah, I mean that's what bothered me about that, particularly since the previous Republican president, George W. Bush, was very proud of his support for a Palestinian state. He was, he tried pretty hard to sort of I think I preferred Clinton's approach more than George W. Bush, but he was definitely publicly committed to the idea of a two-state solution. And Romney, to say it this way, Romney doesn't seem to feel the two-state solution in his kishkas, you might say. He doesn't seem to, it doesn't seem to be a priority for him, which I think is a little disturbing.
Well, I mean, I can see why you have that reaction. I think, as far as I'm concerned, it does matter that this was a private gathering, and this is him. Mm-hmm. This is him telling wealthy donors in Florida. So some of them are probably Jewish Republicans who care quite a little bit about this issue. He's basically telling them, I'm not naive about the barriers to this, and he hasn't publicly dismissed. Dismissed the possibility of a two-state solution. And Eli Lake had a scoop a while back that Sheldon Adelson has privately tried to push him to say out loud the two-state solution is a waste of time and we shouldn't push Israel, and he's refused to do that, which I think has significance as what sort of policy we can exactly expect from him as president. Apparently Adelson also asked him to say some nice things about Jonathan Pollard, which kind of got me.
They need to stop trying to make Jonathan Pollard happy.
Yeah, I had my what I posted on Amspec about that Eli's Adelson story was just why. I understand why people who have half the story have some sympathy for Pollard, but it's really a stupid cause, and he made his own bad, and he deserves what he gets. So
yeah, I mean,
let's move past that rant.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that bothered me about Romney's comments was I think his characterization of the Palestinians as being sort of uniformly opposed to peace was incorrect. There are obviously factions on the Palestinian side who have been working very hard to sort of, towards some kind of reconciliation. And I think it's actually, that part of it is less news because, of course, I think it's a very mainstream Republican thing to say, I don't think the Palestinians want peace, and I don't think they're going to work towards it. But I think that was I think it was very unfair for him to say that, just because, when you look at particularly the past few years, I think there are a lot of elements on the Palestinian side that have been trying pretty hard to meet the Israelis halfway.
I mean, yeah, there are elements, but on the other hand, the most prominent advocate of state building with the goal of coexistence in mind is Salam Fayyad, and he had a fairly prominent portfolio in the government for a while, but he got 3% of the vote. It's not like there are broad constituencies among the Palestinians for an unrestricted right of return for descendants of refugees, which would basically end the Jewish state. There's when Gilad Shalit was kidnapped and they polled the Palestinians about, do you think that operations like this should happen more? It was overwhelmingly supportive. I can see why it might bother you to hear that said. It's like an overwhelming position, but just speaking as shorthand, there are majority views of the Palestinians that, if taken seriously, do mean that a two-state solution is a long way off.
Yeah, maybe it's a long way off, but I think it upset me that Romney's lack of urgency upset me, because I think it's really important for both sides that it not be a long way off. And obviously it's important for the United States and its interests in the region. Obviously, I'm not saying that all of the United States' problems in the region are due to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I do think, it's a major U.S. interest to have a resolution to this. And it's not, I don't think it's presidential to say, we kick it down the road and then we hope that something good happens.
Yeah. I don't think the president should be saying that publicly, because I think even if it, given all of the, correct barriers, all of the barriers that I've talked about, that Romney talked about, are true, it often serves U.S. interests to have the peace process even if it's a convenient fiction, but, which is why I don't think Romney should do what Sheldon Adelson wants him to say, and say that the peace process isn't happening, and Israel should do whatever they want. But on the other hand, I don't know that the costs to having. I know you just conceded that it's not all of our problems. I think it's often overestimated in the discourse how much of our problems in the Middle East are stem from resentment over the lack of a peace plan, and it's also not clear to me that a peace plan would lead to an end to claims among Arab public opinion. And there was I think it was a soccer tournament, and it was broadcast by I want to say Qatar, but it was one of the Gulf states anyway, and the Palestine team was playing, and the picture of the map they used was a map that showed the West Bank and Gaza, and and a lot of Arabs were just furious that they chose a map that didn't include, all of Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, and given what a widespread sentiment that is, it's not clear that the dividends from a two-state solution, whatever the advantages to Israeli security and so forth it's not clear that would mean an end to claims among Arab public opinion and a requisite public diplomacy.
Well, I don't think it's a panacea. Obviously, unfortunately, there's when you look at opinion polls, the perceptions of Jews in Arab countries are extremely negative. And I don't think it's a panacea, but I do think it would be an important step. But at least out of all this, the one thing that I say I am happy about as far as Mitt Romney is concerned is that his campaign has very much reaffirmed their support for a two-state solution in a way that I don't think they were doing before. I mean, the only reference we could find to Mitt Romney explicitly endorsing this, it recently was when he did an interview with Haaretz when he visited Israel for that fundraiser a few months ago. But speaking of the Arab world more broadly, we were going to go on to discuss the Libya attacks, which I think the attack on the U.S. consulate in Libya and the protests elsewhere in the region, which were sort of had something to do with this video that this anti-Muslim video that was put on YouTube. But I think more broadly has a lot to do with domestic politics and anger at the United States generally. But I just think, when Mitt Romney initially responded to the attacks, he put out this statement that, got him a lot of criticism, which is that, instead the Obama administration's response was to sympathize with the attackers, which I found sort of, I thought it was kind of offensive because it was sort of suggesting that, we didn't know that the U.S. ambassador in Libya had been killed yet, but we did know that someone was dead. And it was sort of Mitt Romney. It was almost like Mitt Romney was suggesting that the president of the United States sympathized with the people who killed his ambassador, which I thought was sort of really over the top. And I think from a political perspective was a bad idea because there's obviously some sort of major policy or security or intelligence failure here. And that would have been the immediate topic of discussion had Mitt Romney issued a more low-key statement or even a supportive-sounding statement. But instead, he sort of made the first day of the story about him.
Yeah, I mean, Romney's the thing with that Romney statement, I thought he got a little bit of a bum rap on that because what he was reacting to was a statement that the embassy in Cairo put out that was really quite appalling. That started with, we reject people who abuse their rights to free speech, which is just not something someone who works for the U.S. government should do. And in fact, the superiors in the State Department were upset about that statement too. And Josh Rogan had an interesting TikTok of this that was a guy named Larry Shorts, who was the public affairs officer in charge at the time the ambassador was out of the country, had said, this is the statement I'm going to send, and then they sent back, no, this is problematic, and then his answer was, I already sent it out, and then they spent the day on YouTube defending the statement, and what Romney got wrong in his reaction was that Romney, or whoever his advisor wrote the statement was, clearly thought that statement had come after the embassy attack, and the statement was put out before, and they stood by it on their Twitter account afterwards before eventually backtracking on it. Which is kind of frustrating because just getting that little mistake, if it had been if they'd gotten it quite right, it would have been totally fair. Yes, they put out a statement that was, offering sympathy to an illegitimate grievance instead of defending American values when they should have.
So I think, I'm gonna play defense both for U.S. Embassy Cairo for a second and for the statement itself. So I think, the Cairo Twitter feed, so they deleted a bunch of their tweets afterwards because they were worried about how they were perceived publicly. But the Twitter feed has actually been, it's had some pretty shining moments. I think, one of my favorites was the Muslim Brotherhood's English feed was condemning a breach of the U.S. Embassy, while the Arabic Muslim Brotherhood feed was calling for more protests. And the U.S. Embassy Cairo feed said something along the lines of, "Oh, hey guys, thanks for the warm sentiments. You guys know we read your Arabic feed too, right?"
Yeah, that was funny.
Which I thought was cute. But as far as the statement itself goes, I think that something that is sort of under acknowledged as far as that statement was concerned, and I sort of agree with you that in the sense that the sort of abuse of free speech language is not language I would have chosen. But I think when you, and there was a lot of conservative criticism of Obama and Hillary Clinton as well for sort of rhetorically placing, we don't like this video, but free speech, instead of being like free speech and we condemn this video. But or just the idea of the government condemning the video, period. But I think, when it comes to diplomacy with these countries, a lot of these countries are places where there's a lot of censorship, and I think for some people it's inconceivable that something like this could have been produced and publicized and put on the internet without some sort of approval from the U.S. government, which is, I think, why there was such a great effort to insist that the U.S. government actually had nothing to do with this. And I think there are some of the people who are pushing for a protest are sort of saying there may have actually been rumors that the U.S. government had been involved in producing it, which is like laughable when you look at the actual video, which I think Wired described as having sub-pornographic production values.
Yeah, well, the director of the video apparently was the director of one of the Happy Hooker movies. So.
Well, there was a porn actor who played a guard. He played some sort of guard. He was really. I actually noticed because he had stars on his nipples, and then he turned out to be star tattoos on his nipples, and then he turned out to be a porn star, which was pretty funny. But yeah, I mean, like, this issue of free. And the other thing is that I think I'm less frustrated and less angered by the government statements and not emphasizing free speech as much as I am with some of the other things the administration did, as far as like talking to YouTube and asking them if the video violated their terms of service. I thought was inappropriate because, of course, when the government asks something, it's sort of inherently coercive because they're the government. And the chief of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called this sort of lunatic Florida pastor and said, can you stop promoting this video? Which is something that David Petraeus did back when the same guy was like burning Qurans, which is another incident that sparked violence in Afghanistan. Although obviously, the people who react to this stuff violently are responsible for reacting violently. But this idea that sort of the U.S. government has to, tell people not to say offensive things, I think like really comes close to the line as far as free speech is concerned. Yeah. Because even if you're just asking, you're still the government. You're still, it may not be like direct censorship, but it's a form of coercion that I find inappropriate.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, and I'd be a lot harder on the public statements from the administration than you, because because you're right that people in these countries probably don't quite realize that we have free speech, which is why you have to lead with that. You have to say, we're not in the business of approving videos. This has nothing to do with us, and leave it at that. But when you undercut that message, when you say, and we find the video appalling, you undercut it when you do things like ask YouTube to take it down.
Yeah, definitely if you ask YouTube to take it down, because then you're actually sending the message that maybe you can stop this from happening, which, you shouldn't and can.
Yeah, and I mean, the guy who wrote that statement from the embassy should have been fired, and I was writing that last week pretty passionately, and the fact that Obama's addressed this in an interview with, they're on the ground, I cut them a lot of slack. You get the impression that, while the administration statements weren't as bad as the embassy statement that was withdrawn, they were sort of in that spirit, and you get the sense that, they don't think it's that off. And the thing is, this wasn't, blaming the YouTube video is just not legitimate either on First Amendment grounds or really on empirical grounds. The YouTube video has been around a while. The protests, it wasn't a coincidence that this happened on 9/11. And particularly in Libya, it wasn't really an embassy protest. It was a coordinated terrorist attack with 20 people assaulting the embassy. It was clearly planned in advance. There are, reports have gotten shockingly little attention that there were warnings from the Libyan government that this security threat existed, and that circles back to what you said earlier about why the Romney campaign isn't making this about the obvious, the obvious security failure that happened here, and that they should be hitting that harder, and they're not. I feel like all the criticism they got for, okay, this statement was a little off key and maybe the timing wasn't great. I feel like they've just been spooked
so the administration's assessments are a little at odds here, right? Because they've said we don't have evidence that the attack was pre-planned, but on the other hand, they've also said that they believe militant groups and possibly groups with ties to Islamic extremists may have been responsible, which sort of that's I think that's not necessarily a contradiction, but you'd have to slice the pastrami pretty thin to explain how that's the case. I mean, maybe they didn't know that they were going to get the ambassador, or maybe they these were extremist groups who spontaneously decided to. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. It seems very difficult to buy the administration line that this was not at all premeditated. And I think I think we're probably going to find out that there was a pretty serious lapse somewhere. But I think it's interesting because arguably the bigger problem. Arguably the bigger problem is Egypt because we have a much worse relationship with their government than we do with the government in Libya.
Yeah,
where the big problem is that the government in Libya likes us, but sort of can't really control its country yet.
Yeah, I mean clearly the Libyan response. There's immediately apologies for what happened because it is the host country's responsibility to provide security, and clearly their security was infiltrated. This didn't just. I think there was one report that one of the police officers who were supposed to be guarding the embassy were taking pictures in advance of the attack. Clearly, the government is too weak to control the embassy, but they did apologize for that, and they have made arrests of people related to this group, and there have been, and you have seen anti-violence protests in Benghazi and Tripoli that were kind of touching. It's not. I mean, there are hundreds of hardcore anti-American, ideologically bin Ladenist people in Libya, and it's a serious problem. But they don't.
It's interesting though because I think they have if you look at they lost all the it's one of the more interesting things about. If you had told me a couple of years, before the elections, when the sort of the revolution had started in Libya and the protests in Tahrir Square had started in Egypt, if you had told me that Libya would have had an election where the Islamists all lost and Egypt would have had one where they all won, I think I probably wouldn't have believed that.
Yeah.
And I probably would have been surprised that there was an election in Libya at all. But the good news is that these guys they don't see there may be some a high number of individual extremists in Libya, but they don't seem to have popular support at all.
Yeah, and in Egypt it's a different story. I mean, they may have some popular support, but it's not enough
to win seats in an election.
Yeah, well, I think the Islamist parties ended up with some seats once they were allocated, but in the election results they did poorly in a way that surprised a lot of people, in part because the non-Islamist elements became well-known leaders because the way they won their revolution was by convincing the West to intervene. So the guys who were good at convincing the West had a lot of credibility, so they did very well. But in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is consolidating power, and the even more radical Salafist elements are also a big part of the picture, and it's just obvious that the Egyptian government let this happen. They could have provided security if they wanted to, and they didn't. And Morsi was not apologizing for it happening right away. He was sort of he was sympathizing with the attackers, quite empathizing with the attackers. Obama's statements might have offered sympathy. Morsi's statements were they're totally right. and he backed off that a little bit once the administration leaned on him a little bit, which
right, they dinged him a little bit by saying Obama said he wasn't sure whether Egypt was an ally, and then they retracted it, which I think actually it's an accurate statement. But
that was an interesting little episode, because if you're technically Egypt is an ally,
technically yes,
but they're not behaving like an ally, so it's probably defensible for the president to be saying that. But if you're going to say that, it would help to have a strategy around it. And if you look at some of the follow-up reporting, like Tommy Vietor's answer was that, he was just talking in technical terms because we don't have this treaty with them. And that's almost the opposite of the truth. In technical terms, they are legally an ally. But
I can't tell whether it was shrewd or a mistake, because it really worked. After he chewed out Morsi, and then he went in public and said that on the phone is what the New York Times reported, that he chewed out Morsi over the phone, and then he went publicly and said, I don't know if Egypt's an ally. And Morsi changed his tune and reaffirmed his responsibility to protect the embassy. And then the Obama administration was sort of stuck in this sort of embarrassing explanation for why he had said it. But it's it worked, but it's not clear whether it was deliberate or not.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But I mean, I don't know. My view on Egypt is that obviously the Muslim Brotherhood had a lot more time to organize, but I think I'm not sure that there's much you can do about the United States can do about the domestic politics of Egypt. I think ultimately, this is a doctrine that is going to play itself out. It was one that I think has appeal in a situation where you're living under a dictatorship, but it will eventually fail when exposed for long enough to the marketplace of ideas. As long as Egyptians continue to have elections, eventually I think they're going to lose, and the country's going to change.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the timeline on that is, but I'm neocon enough to be sympathetic with that view.
Is that neoconish to think that?
Well, it's something liberal internationalists and neocons think, and the sort of.
Well, sometimes you can't tell the difference. I guess.
And then the sort of hard Jacksonian wing it sort of rejects that view, and then I have long arguments over hours of drinks with fellow conservatives about it, and but yeah, the one thing I'd say though is that there's I forget where it was, but there was an Egyptian liberal. I think I wrote about it at the time, but there was an Egyptian liberal who said something like the U.S. should be lukewarm toward the Brotherhood, because if you denounce them too hard, that helps them, because that plays into their narrative of resistance against imperialism. But if you're too nice to them, that also helps them, because that hands them successes. So. And I think the Obama administration has erred on the side of being a little too solicitous towards the Brotherhood at times, and I think the fact that squeezing them a little bit did move Morsi a little bit is a sign that if you can strike that balance a little better than I think they've done.
Well, with that, I think it's time to wrap things up. But John, I appreciate you coming on Adamize, and it's a pleasure to talk and argue with you.
Oh, yeah, so it's always a pleasure to talk to you online or off. So thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Yep.